looking forward to this discussion. So I first met you, Stephen, I guess it's going on almost 10 years now. And it was, really about practical architecture, the trade-offs, what we need to do. And, when I think about practicality, right, and people trying to push cars uphill with wet ropes, I think you've been the champion of sort of finding that, pointing it out, and I'm really looking forward to the panel discussion. So Stephen, I'll let you introduce yourself in a bit more detail, and then we can do a roundtable on the panel. I'll drop off and let the panel discussion begin.
Thanks, Bryce. So I'm Steve Cohen. I'm currently a chief architect for industry solutions at Microsoft. Industry solutions used to be called Microsoft Services. Name change, got to roll with it. Basically specialize in rapid response and project recovery stuff. So as Bryce mentioned, I tend to see ugly and bad in the world. But that's really not important. I am humbled to have with me these fine gentlemen. And so I'm going to pass it over to them to introduce themselves. Why don't we start with Mike?
Me?
Yes.
Okay.
It's going to be like that all night. Surprise.
Yeah, sure. Why not? What can I tell you? I've known Steve for 20 years, maybe slightly more than that. Yeah, I know. At least 22. I first was working for Microsoft Services, and Steve was our client, and I was showing him how COM could meet needs in a distributed architecture thing that he was working on for a defense contractor. And within 6 months, I was also trying to recruit him to come work for us at Microsoft. He did. He stayed. The company's a lot better off because of it. Since then, I've left, but in between then, I went on to doing a lot of collaborative development. First with very low-level code using Exchange server back when it was situated on premises a lot. Segued into a lot of SharePoint-related things, joined the SharePoint team, and sort of got into the collaboration space in the low-code, no-code, sometimes the citizen developer space, but more low-code business application productivity, especially when it comes to developer evangelism. And so I've spent the past 15 years working for 2 different companies in the low-code space, and that's kind of my thing at this point.
How about Gar? I'll be next.
So I know Stephen for less time than that, but I still know him for probably the guts of 10, 12 years, we think. We're still trying to figure out where, but it was somewhere in the US. And I've been involved with Iasa since, I think, 2004, and started a chapter in Ireland way back then. So I'm based in Ireland, and I work for the Health Service Executive, which is the, I don't know what the equivalent in the US is, but it's the organization there a state organization to deliver, a national organization to deliver healthcare services. Right, and that's across the whole full gamut. So it's hospitals through to community, primary, the full suite of things. So I guess the past 2 years have been interesting. So COVID kind of put a point on things and really kind of brought a lot of focus into how we do things, what we had, what we didn't have. And then last year we had just a layer on top, one pane on top of another. We got hit by a massive cyber attack, which completely flattened the entire system. So like the agency is like 150,000 people, and it's everywhere in the country. So it's all over the place. So everything went dark. Like we turned everything off, and then we turned it all back on. So that was an interesting experience. And then you get a sense of where things are and how things are moving. And then as you begin to look forward, it kind of brings some stuff with it. So that's kind of been me. And before that, like I've been an architect for, actually, I was trying to figure it out. So there was the first time somebody called me an architect or gave me the title. And then there was the first point I realized, what is that? They were 2 different points, but as long as the pay was commensurate with the title, I was okay with that at the time. I was willing to take that one on the chin. And actually, I know Wayne since probably 2010, 2011 as well, and he sat in my seat at the board, which is great fun. Thanks, Wayne.
Anytime. I can still remember the questions, Gar.
Oh God, so do I.
You remember the answer?
No.
So Wayne, that leaves it to you. Little introduction.
Yeah, I think we're starting this off with how long we've known Stephen. So I'd probably say about 12 years. I have to say, Stephen has been a rock in terms of the architecture community. I was previously the architect role owner for Microsoft, so worked quite closely with Stephen in MCS and was responsible for a whole bunch of initiatives in Microsoft in the sort of 9 years that I spent at Microsoft. I left Microsoft, went over to Accenture for about 12 months before heading back to the UK to be the head of digital architecture for HSBC globally. So I was responsible for the $1 billion investment HSBC had made in their digital DevSecOps journey, which I have to say was the most interesting couple of years of my entire life when it comes to architecture and DevSecOps. And then for the last 3 years, I've been back in Seattle as the chief architect for Dell Technologies Select. So really concentrating on the top 120 accounts for Dell Technologies globally. The typical usual suspects of those top 120 accounts, and leading an enterprise architecture sort of function from a center of excellence perspective for Dell Technologies. So that's me in a nutshell.
All righty.
And you by far have the nicest background of the four of us.
And it's not even fake. Look at that.
Real. He lives
Yeah,
there. Can you believe that?
And, I'm expecting two people to sit in the back with
The president
Whiskey
and the
to
vice
talk about
president. There's an
supply.
oval on the carpet there.
If Joe Biden walks in and sits down,
Exactly.
Yeah, and I guess I'll take this moment in front of everybody to say, Wayne, I got mail from you, and yes, we'll be there.
You are a star. Thank you.
There you go. That aside, as a bonus to anybody who's listening, this is a no slide presentation. So this is us, just four old architects who are going to chat a bit. Let me go ahead and start with Gar because he's got one of the most effective lines I have, starting with the exit. I think every architect should know how to get out, but I know you like to talk about the exits to architecture.
so I get the background of this. So we were discussing like what we would talk about for it, and one of the bits, I guess it's come into like real stark relief as you see what happens when you let stuff accrete over time. So when everything gets collapsed and you're bringing it back, you see all of the stuff that's been left and been left rot. But actually, the idea for the exit architecture was actually based on, so there's a Rita Gunter McGrath is kind of a strategy. She's like, I think she's a professor in a university, and she's kind of written books on strategy. And she wrote something on transient advantage, which was kind of it would come. It wasn't sustainable competitive advantage. Stuff would come along, you'd have to surf the wave and then hop off. And anybody who's ever tried to surf, the bit getting on is hard enough, but getting off at the wrong time is incredibly painful. So the idea was that how would you exit? So then from an architecture perspective, we got very good at kind of building the bit to get you on, but that quickly became kind of quick drying architecture. So it just stuck and it froze in place. And then it was very difficult because you needed to chisel it out of there to kind of get it out, and you got a jackhammer and you kind of dug it out because it wasn't designed to leave and to exit gracefully. And then what happened as a result of that was you basically got, and it was a concept of kind of resource hostaging, right? So there were just resources just being held hostage and you couldn't release it. And it was about people, skills, talent, time, money, everything else kind of was just retained and kept there. So as you begin to think through that, then you're thinking about, well, as I go in, because we get very excited at the start, but if you're not thinking about how you're going to exit this and how you're going to unhook it gracefully and unhook and release and reclaim those resources, then you're screwed and you're tied into something. So that was kind of the original concept for it. So
you were here to talk about, modern architecture. That's the theme Iasa gave us anyway. How do you see that changing, or how should it be changing?
It's nearly reversing the thought process, though, in that like we're so busy thinking about how we're going to create something that we forget that bit. So if you think about that and you walk that story backwards to where will this go, how long will it last, the durability of it, the opportunity, why are we doing this, and where will it go? And we actually, I mean, it was a really interesting one because we stood loads of stuff up really quickly, and we knew we'd have to turn it off at some point. So now we're in the middle of that process. But because it was so quick, it's like everything's been compressed. Usually these cycles take years, and the problem is compounded by the fact it's moving from person to person to person. So it turns into a knowledge management problem as well as everything else. So I guess from a modern architecture perspective, it is actually thinking in terms of those that idea of a transient advantage, that idea that these things are impermanent, that this isn't forever, and you've got to think about that aspect of it. And we're usually thinking in terms of product and life cycle and things like that. But actually, like one of the things that I always used as a hallmark for a good organization was how well could it kill projects and how well could it kill systems, and stake through the heart, dead, over, finished, right? And were incapable of doing that, then probably you were just building up this debt that you were going to have to pay off at some point. So I think one of the foundation pieces for modern architecture is actually getting good at some of those things. And getting good is both a practice of doing it, but it's also the design of thinking about how you're going to unhook and decouple these things when you're putting them in the first place, as opposed to we'll worry about that when we're doing it, because we're so worried about the start that we forget about the end. So that's kind of the.
You know, I'm a big fan, and I'm going to move over to Wayne here, because part of getting out is getting the value that you promised at the beginning, right? Because almost always a big architecture change is we're going to turn off this old system.
Yeah.
And if you don't get to that, then you've got twice the cost running. And I know in the world you're in right now, Wayne, the hyper-converged and consolidate architecture is one of those steps in the process. How do you see that kind of moving from old to new to change and back working as we get to the modern world?
Yeah,
we're in the modern world.
Yeah, I'd like to think we're in the modern world sometimes, but again, it's new technology and old ways of doing things is a common pattern that I continue to see. And I never say modern architecture is about the technology. It's about, you know, culture and people and operations and all those elements that sit around it. So I definitely don't want to sit here and think, you know, when we talk about hyper-converged, it's modern architecture and you've transformed. Obviously, the space that I'm playing in with Dell, even some of the relationships that we have with Microsoft in terms of the edge conversations and hyper-converged, you know, there are benefits to HCI specifically when you look at things such as performance increase, when you look at the ability to reduce operational costs as a consideration. And there is this element even that HCI touches upon that even Gar mentioned that I experienced in my time at HSBC and a fair few other organizations around unmanaged deviation expense and technical debt that is often overlooked when it comes to turning those things off. So when I look at HCI specifically, it's interesting where it fits for me. First of all, you know, it tends to be aimed at organizations that are not fully public cloud native in terms of solutions. And we obviously live in a multi-cloud, and I'll get the term right, not multi-dash cloud, although we live in a hybrid multi-dash cloud and multi-cloud world today. And the other 23 variants of cloud types that are out there. That design thinking that sits behind cloud is what we find with our customers is, you know, workload placement is still relevant. So the way that I'm tying this up is a lot of organizations we have this concept of estate 1 and estate 2 in BTS specifically. And a lot of customers, you know, are doing the normal things such as rationalization, consolidation, optimization, etc. And HCI sort of plays an element to that because of workload placement in the preparation for moving to public cloud or a mixture of hybrid cloud in a multi-cloud world. For those organizations that have decided to embrace multi-cloud and have workload placement still on premise or through paid-for services like what we have through Apex, then HCI gives them some operational costs, but performance increase as part of rationalization, consolidation, optimization as part of the journey to public cloud. But what I'm seeing more and more, and you know, even my time at Microsoft, I can remember a time being at a Tech Ready event where somebody said infrastructure was dead. And we sort of bought into that at the time, and I sort of bought into it, as you would expect from somebody, an organization like Microsoft pushing public cloud and consumption. But obviously what's really happened is that mixture of multi-cloud, and I think it's going to be here to stay. And HCI just forms part of that because of the decisions for workload placement on premise, which is the stepping stone to modern architecture. But to Gar's point, if you still don't turn off and understand your customer journeys, go through some of these old systems, you end up without an exit plan. Right. So tying these things together is obviously important, especially from a hyper-converged perspective.
Yeah,
I think infrastructure is far from dead. It just isn't about hardware as much as it used to be.
Yeah, well, that's you hit a point, Mike, which is obviously everything's moved up to the software layer. If you look at hyper-converged, that's that operational performance expendability that you get by moving to the software layer. And you know, here's the interesting thing: there is still some elements of hardware that sit on the back end of it, and companies like Dell make a significant amount of money by that infrastructure, which is good for me.
Yeah, but there are many more industries beside the sort of standard enterprises we talk about. If you look at manufacturing or something disconnected like mining or oil and gas,
yeah,
you have to have hardware there.
Yeah.
Because pure physics, the
Very
latency
true.
just can't be handled.
Yeah, we talk about edge. It's interesting when we talk about hyperconvergent edge, and there's obviously a whole multitude of definitions for edge. And I don't know what everyone's view on this call is. When we look at edge,
We'll find out.
our definition of edge is where value is derived or identified and consumed, which obviously means there has to be some sort of element of infrastructure to support that. The interesting thing is we used to base our stack on where data resides, but actually the data residual doesn't necessarily sit on hard disks anymore. It sits in non-volatile memory and cached, and then basically relevant data moved to public cloud or on-prem or whatever the use case is for it. So it's an interesting world we've moved into in terms of basically dealing with that ambiguity and complexity, and it makes it more difficult, to Gar's point. Actually, it makes it more difficult to turn things off. It's obviously our intent to understand that life cycle, but unless you think about it up front and have a plan to turn it off, and I've seen this in every single FTSE 100 company, they don't have the plan to turn it off. Even with hyperconverged, it's additional technology on top of others, with customer journeys traversing those architectural elements, and then they wonder why operational expenditure is going through the roof and not getting the value out of public cloud or multi-cloud, which is interesting.
You're making me think, because it's we've all seen the time model where it's like tolerate, invest, migrate, eliminate, and eliminate gets jammed, and then you suddenly realize we're just going to have to suck it up and live with it, and it just gets jammed into the tolerate stuff that we hate. We don't want to tolerate it, but we do.
Yeah, but I want to shift this over to Mike a bit, because he's got a different position than I think the three of us in a lot of ways. He is closest to the sort of no code, low code world, which is leverage all that stuff back there instead of own it.
I depend desperately on I work for a company, Webcon is the name of the company, that is all about using architecture to sort of we depend on a lot of code in order to present application developers with a low code experience. So architecture absolutely matters, but if the business application builder sees it, we failed. And that's a problem. In fact, we've had something, it's evolved a lot, but our platform, Webcom BPS, has been around for 17 years now. The application builder experience, I won't call it a developer because people like to pick nits, and we just don't need to go there. They're developers, they're not coders, but it just depends on your point of view, and let's just call them builders so we don't have to argue about that. What I will say is that application builders have been able to use our technology 17 years ago when it was rendering ASP.NET pages and working against, all sorts of stuff. That same low-code experience has evolved, but now it expresses forms in React, and it does all kinds of crazy stuff in the back end that didn't exist before. Right. They don't notice. So we've had to refactor architecture, and yes, we have ended some things. The way we did that is establishing a contract with the business application builder that we've held constant. But it's freed us to change all kinds of things in the back end. If you want to call us, a middleware platform, sure, why not? But yeah, sure. But the key is a whole bunch of stuff in the back end has evolved on a very regular basis, and the reason we've been able to get away with it is because the people that use us never see it. Yeah, that's the part that matters a lot. Essentially, what we're trying to do is to create a subset architecture that's really flexible to build a lot of different kinds of applications, but is still restrictive enough that what you're going to build isn't going to be disrupted by a substantive change on the back end. That's not easy, but it can be done. You kind of need to decide, we do this, here are the boundaries with which we're going to work, and now do anything you want within those boundaries. I love this example. It's a little esoteric, but I think it'll be okay. David Byrne of the Talking Heads, several years back, when I was working in SharePoint in the Office group, he was spending some time doing art in PowerPoint, like a really, really restrictive environment. But because of the restrictions, he was able to focus on getting things done without thinking about how to get those things done. He just was able to work. Sometimes restrictions allow for an immense amount of creativity, and trying to be too open-ended works against you.
Yeah.
I love fancy architecture applied at big, huge scaling business problems. Applying too much willful, deliberate, in-your-face architecture at the long tail of smaller scale business applications will kill you.
Mark, can I ask a question? Is that all right, Stephen? Can I just a quick one on
Sure.
you mentioned platform building. Like, what is that? Is that a different mindset for architects in terms of building platforms for consumption to do stuff? Is that in terms of where you're working and what you're doing? Is that?
You asking me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that. Well, basically, I think I could see applying a lot of architecture thinking and a lot of architecture work in a couple of different scenarios. One, I might use it for one very big organization defining mission critical, this is who we are and what we do application. And it needs to scale massively, and it needs to do a fixed number of things really, really well. And we're going to evolve it, but there are a lot of moving parts. So we need to think really, really hard as to what it's going to be, so that by the time we deliver it, we've gotten it right. Yeah. And we can make certain kinds of agile changes as time goes by, but the fundamental architecture is going to be really disruptive to modify. I see that happening. I might apply a lot of architectural thinking to, the overall plumbing within an organization, no matter which kinds of applications they put forth.
I think that's where we're kind of at this point, is there is real stability in global networking and in the hard infrastructure.
Yeah.
There's some flexibility when you get on top of that in machinery and the storage. And as we get closer and closer to the real users, I guess, or customers as they would be, it goes through sort of a point, and then it's got to open up again, where
Correct.
They're constrained, and then they get their value back out of it. But
Correct.
It also applies to risk, right? We're risk shifting from the users down into people like Dell and Microsoft and others, so that we have to be stable, so that you can do what you have to.
That's absolutely right. And if you're lucky, you get to present stability using shifting sands in the back end as the world evolves. But what you need to do is create stability for everyone else.
I want to kind of jump on that to move back at Wayne for a second, because that stability is part of the supply chain discussion that we have now. In the US, we have this executive order from the White House that basically says we need to know where everything goes and what it touches. But supply chain it's an architectural problem.
Yep.
You have to have timing and integration points and so on. And I kind of wonder, Wayne, how you see that working out.
It's interesting in terms of it's changing. The reason I asked about the platform question actually ties into this conversation to some degree as well. It's not necessarily building supply chain systems. If we're talking about supply chain systems that support those supply chains, is difficult because it touches everything from regulatory to compliance to order to reporting to confirmation to continuation. It covers the whole stack. The changes that are taking place is what I see as the speed of supply chain, and specifically basically how that ties in with the architectural decisions through that supply chain ecosystem. So for me, I mean, the challenges are the same in a simple business model in terms of consumer buys a good gets delivered, goes through those elements. But the elements to support the technology in terms of the demand on the supply chain are not, in some degree, are not always technology focused. They're process focused, they're business focused, etc. So, will there be impacts? Yes. But how is it that you provide some of the telemetry information? How does AI ops look for bottlenecks in the supply chain? I think these are the things that are coming in that will really fundamentally change the landscape for supply chain companies and supply chain systems globally. Because at the moment, I think people are treading carefully around things like, we've all heard DevSecAI Ops as a new coin term above and beyond DevSecOps. But I'm yet to see, more than a handful of companies that are doing this well and have embraced it in terms of basically doing that effectively. So it's these technology points that I think are going to, predict and prevent and propensity models, all that good stuff that fits into the supply chain, will actually change that landscape significantly. But we've still got a long way to go in terms of basically the specifics of getting customers and the skill set and the talent and the support to trust those systems to do it effectively.
Yeah, the trust is a key word in there for me, and I'm going to kind of bounce back to Mike. The low code, no code, you have this reliance on platform and so on. How far does that black box go? Wait, what do you want to know versus what can you know?
There's actually a big challenge there, because even amongst people that love low code, no code, they tend to want to do anything they want with it and have a really hard time wrestling with the fact that by definition we're restricting what you're working with in order to provide you with the stability you say you need, and you really do need. You want some degree of changeability within a certain framework. You want stability. You want to be able to depend on what you're relying on so that you can focus on business logic, the what, and spend a lot less time on the why, and spend a lot less time on the how.
But is the
some
trust
low-code
real?
systems are optimized for this, others are not.
Yeah, but to me, and we went through this in prior waves, right? So like Visual Basic, you didn't know how it worked. It seemed like magic. Really terrible software got written really quickly.
Correct.
I think we're better than that now. But at the same time, telemetry is a very low level thing. And as Wayne mentioned, you need that to know what's going on. You got low code, no code working on this top with nothing but blanket trust, because they can't see below this very dense layer.
That's correct. But again, not all low code, no code systems are designed equally. So let's, I don't expect you guys to necessarily know what on BPS, but you're probably familiar with SAP. And depending on which subsystems within SAP you're working with, they have some low code, no code technology in there. And they are essentially a higher level platform built upon a lot of lower level architecture. They don't go so far up the stack towards the users as say we do, but it's a good straw man to use in this case. There's an incredible amount of structure on what you can and cannot do with SAP, but you can get a lot done with it. And there are people in the background preventing it from breaking, but from the point of view of the people in front of the line, it doesn't break. It's rock solid. They perceive it to be boring, but really, really reliable.
Yeah, well, boring is good. I don't want to ignore Gar here in the corner. He's the corner of my screen.
I'm interested in just following up on that one, because I think that the low code, no code one was interesting in that we were optimizing for a different problem, in that we couldn't get skills in the market. We couldn't find developers to do it. So this simplified it. So it pushed a lot of stuff down into the stack and it sped things up. So it made it go faster. It didn't mean we could, to Stephen's point, it didn't mean we couldn't create more crap faster, or that we wouldn't create more crap. And SharePoint, I think, is probably the best illustration. I remember Jim Wilt, who I believe was on that team as well, telling me that this is not what we intended. We created this thing, but it's not what we wanted to use it for. The great SharePoint skip experiment of throw stuff in. So you're getting flashbacks, Mike.
Oh God, yes. Well, I founded developer evangelism on SharePoint, so I'm partially responsible for that. But what can I tell you? A lot of people can build a lot of crap, but we really should separate two concepts here. They're related, and we tend to think of them at the same time, but they're not the same thing. There's low code, no code development, and almost nothing's no code. So let's just say low code. And there's citizen development. And citizen development tends to depend on low code because very few citizen developers can code. Some of them do. And if you think of script, if you call PowerShell code, then a lot of infrastructure people are citizen developers. But let's leave that off to the side. That's, again, picking it. Citizen developers build a lot of crap that need to get bailed out after the fact. If you really lock down what they're able to do, they can do less damage. But low code is a way to self-document a lot more easily. Low code is a way to buy a lot of infrastructure stability because the stuff behind the scenes you don't see and don't have to care about because clever people like us see to it that they never need to.
Yeah.
In the hands of a professional developer who can think like a dev, they can do wonderful things with low code.
But that's kind of where we're at, and I'm kind of moving back towards Gar here, who's in the more the traditional developer space, as you would say. But Agile has been another one of these great things turned ugly and maybe coming back around again. I'm a big fan when it's done well. Unfortunately, I don't get to applaud it very often. But Gar, the idea of minimum viable product, MVP, it haunts me, and everything can be iterative, not necessarily incremental, iterative. How are you seeing all this next wave stuff kind of working in your space and still supporting that?
And I guess so. This is one of the things that for someone like the big opportunity I see for low code, no code in terms of this is the opportunity to build and then throw it away. So it's a disposable thing that I don't care, right? It does, it puts the point and I move on and I can learn as I go and I can learn very fast that way. So as a tool to learn very fast, get it. I think the minimum viable, like that gets, and it is now, it's in the language and it like people use it to taunt me now. And I see very little that's minimum and certainly not very much that's viable. And the idea of, for whatever P you choose to pick, and actually it was interesting because as we had the Defence Forces in Ireland working with us, and there was a colonel there who was like a proper serious dude, and he was like I always felt like I wasn't a real man when I stood beside him because he was like serious. He was like uniform, the whole thing, little switch in the back of his head to move his eyes, everything. And he explained, I was explaining something to him about what we were trying to do, and he goes, I get it. It's an initial operating capability, so an IOC. So when they deploy and you go somewhere, we have an initial operating capability, and that's what we build. And that concept is, I think, is far more powerful than the MVP. So the initial operating capability is just enough to make it work, but it works. And it doesn't matter what we're doing behind the scenes, but it works. Mike, you wanna?
Yeah, the thing I wanted to add is I know exactly what you're talking about, and I agree with it completely, but I think we got there because too many people focused on the word minimum and not on the word viable. An MVP still has to be V, and an initial operating capability, it still has to operate. It was the middle letter that was the problem with MVP. In other words, they thought, oh, we're going to build enough functionality and we don't need to worry about if it's stable, and we don't need to worry about whether it logs telemetry, or from a business point of view, whether it creates an audit trail that attorneys and other people can take a look at. We don't care about any of that. That can come later. No, that stuff has to come up front. That's basic infrastructure. That's basic architecture. What you want the application to accomplish, that can evolve incrementally.
You both made an interesting points to that question, Stephen, because and I agree with everything that you just said, that the interesting point for me was that what was missed, and this term got coined later on after MVP was coined, was minimal viable architecture. So when you look at the minimal viable architecture to support the MVP, there is this missing element. So if you look at Scaled Agile as an example, when you look at your 12-month runway in terms of basically the architectural roadmap, that was the first definition of what your architectural runway was going to have. So what's not been joined together in these conversations around Scaled Agile and MVP and minimal viable architecture is, yes, MVP is still valid. Yes, you can still just create an application that allows you to log on. That is still a viable application and architecture. But unless you have an architectural runway in the MVA, then basically you can't communicate basically the functional elements that will be built up as subsequent MVPs come in. So that mix of lack of understanding of MVP and MVA have not been joined together. And you'll only see now that this conversation talking about minimal viable architecture to support the MVP as part of the architectural runway and scaled agile 4.5 and above. So these types of conversations are interesting because the terms are out there, but the correlation in terms of the communication to bring them together are not clearly understood. You know,
Right, I think we've missed the audience though, because MVP was supposed to be an internal dev thing, right? We did stuff, nobody was really going to go try to use it. It was just, let's get something done, so we make a step and then make another step.
Well, no, we took it from product development, as in it was never an engineering or an architectural statement. It was a project management statement.
Then it became a customer thing. Like, we're going to give you a minimum viable product. And I think you can go from viability to operational, which is I really like from Gar, out in the world of real people. Stuff has to work when you give it to them, more or less in whole.
But that's the point. So you have let's take the example of a logon. There's your MVP, log on to the application. Operationally, you need architecture, you need telemetry, you need observability, you need reliability, you need testability to support the MVP to make it operational. And because everyone concentrated on the MVP, they forgot about the minimum viable architecture to support it. And that's when we ended up in this world of pain where we never really had MVPs. We were building these monolithic agile solutions that we called them because they hadn't put those two concepts together.
To track it back,
we're in a state of raging agreement.
Exactly.
We brought in the MVP, and that was all about the function and the behavior and structure. It never featured because they didn't care. So that was, we'll deal with that later once we get funded, right? And that was the objective. And now we've co-opted it, and now we're first with it.
Yeah.
So I forbid it. You are not allowed to say minimum viable anything near me.
This is my view. MVP's has taken over the word draft version 1. So that my honest opinion is people use MVP to explain draft version 1, which is the wrong correlation when we talk about technology and architecture specifically.
I know Mike can jump in.
We don't view MVP like that, although we don't really call it MVP because of all the baggage around that concept. But an initial release will have a limited amount of business logic and a very basic user interface associated with it, but it's already got all of the architecture and the plumbing necessary to make sure it's stable and evolvable and reliable and
I got to steal from one of the speakers prior in the day. We're trying to mature to this assemble to order from build to order, right? So the build to order, we didn't really know exactly what it was. We're all learning together along the way. And we put stuff. Assemble, we now are driving towards integration in marketplaces and composability. So architecture, it's got to fit the same shift. We've got to move with that.
Yes. But there's a dance to be done here, because I'll tell you, on the one hand, yes, you should be able to take one thing from column A, one thing from column B, and if they were designed to work together, you should be able to snap them together and make them work. I don't think we're quite there, and I don't think we can get quite there. I think we need to make a lot of things easier, and I think we need to present somebody with stable options. But here's the problem, especially when we're talking about integrating services. It's a human problem. Wayne, I think it was you, and then might have been Gar. It was probably both of you. And it would have been Steve, except he hasn't talked as much as the rest of us.
He's just asking the question.
I'm enabling.
It's a human problem. It's a political problem. It's an organizational and a structural problem. If I want to connect together Salesforce and SAP, not only are those two different data sources, two different APIs, it's two different groups of people with an organization curating those assets that want to know what it is you want to do with their stuff to make sure, at the very, very least, you're using it properly, and the very, very worst, not breaking it.
But that's the shift here, is we need to make stuff that's safer so that they can do that. So that it, in your case, particularly low code snaps top to bottom to stuff. Now we're talking about snapping side to side.
Right.
You know, we need to mature to that modern approach.
Correct. But I do think to a certain extent, assembled infrastructure is a lot like data warehousing and business intelligence. You build that stuff, you curate that stuff, you don't buy it.
Fair. But
tools and architectural assumptions and components and stability absolutely help. Yes.
I'm going to push back to Gar a bit. Mostly this is I know I sent this one to you in advance, the insourcing
Yeah.
versus outsourcing problem. For a long time, we started pushing things out because it was supposed to be better. And I think we've probably seen that pendulum swing. Out is not inherently evil. I don't want to tell everybody that's bad, because there are cases. But things are moving back into control. And I know in the big groups that you're managing right now, how's that impacting you and the underlying architecture for that?
So I guess if I look, so that like the health service is so big and so vast, like the strategy was to give it to everybody else, like to source it. And so from like I guess a development and engineering perspective, there was no culture of that. There was no build piece. And then as you begin to grow it inside of an organization, you're inheriting lots and lots and lots and lots of pieces. So and I guess one of the challenges here in Ireland anyway, and it's everywhere, I mean, everybody's suffering from this, is just that skills piece. So for any of the bigger partners that are out there, it's effectively hostage economics. We can't hire them at the rates that they can get in the market. So we have to then pay. So we're ransomed into getting bodies and resources. So that's kind of, there's an issue and a contention issue around that. But I think we're just going to flip back and forward on this over the years. And I actually don't think, for some of the problems that we're trying to solve now, I think it's a different lens we need to look at it through. So one of the things that came out of COVID was just our ability to innovate and work with novel technologies at speed via open source was something that kind of grew out of it. So all of a sudden, so that one of the things I worked on was like digital contact tracing, right? So that popped up. All of a sudden, there was like 40 countries all working simultaneously in parallel and all collaborating, and all publishing stuff into GitHub, all collaborating on Slack, all stuff running through it. We began to find places, find each other, and start working on those problems. And I think it's particularly in those situations, and this was a mix of public and private. It wasn't just public organizations, it was private organizations. So we had teams from all over the place, and hybrid teams were just emerging. For bigger things that we're working on, because I think there's going to be the traditional kind of corporate IT stuff, and that's going to go back and forth as we're going to put it over here, and we're going to put it over there, and we're going to bring it back in. But for the big things, and I'm like, if you think about it in like big as in UN Sustainable Development Goals, big, right? Those kind of big problems that we all have, where it's in all of our interest to try and solve these problems. The open way of solving it together, it really does embrace kind of the collective intelligence. It's bringing people together, but it's a very, very different way of working. It's a very different way of structuring, of organizing, of doing anything with it. And you can run very fast, but you can run into a wall very quickly. So,
but there's still a need for somebody to be responsible for operation and management and patching and revving. And sometimes you've got to pull that back from the open world. Because if you're doing a governmental system, the government itself has to have that liability, not 150 people spread around the world.
Yeah, I see something else happening as well in the industry, and I wasn't sure whether this would ever happen. The conversation has shifted a little bit from outsourcing, nearshoring, offshoring. That conversation has quietened down compared to what it was 15, 20 years ago. What I have seen, and this, we knew this was coming in terms of, you know, when Dr. Jeannie Ross came into Microsoft, and we talk about the models change. It used to be plan, build, run, and you know, that was the model. Now it's commit to platform, build and run still there, but exploitation of technology investment. And I'm seeing, like, take the banking industry. How many on this call would have thought Chase, Lloyds would have moved their core banking to a software as a service company like Thought Machine or 10X? And you know, everybody thought that's never going to happen in the banking and the financial services. You know, we have fast forward today, and those services are now performed by Thought Machine and 10X. And the conversation shifting, where we used to think about offshoring for skill, we're now basically outsourcing for capability. And that outsourcing for capability has shifted. You know, I still, as the head of digital architecture in HSBC, one of my remits was to look at strategic architecture and engineering location strategy. So that, you know, do we have people in London? They cost more than we had if we had people in Poland, if they cost more than we had people in Vancouver. So we had a capability placement strategy, not an offshore, nearshore, offshore conversation, but actually our capability conversation sort of stemmed over the offshore, nearshore, inshore conversation in terms of service capabilities around the technical architecture being provided, if that makes sense. And that's a big shift that I've seen over the last 5 or 10 years that's sort of dwarfing the offshore, nearshore conversation to some degree.
But what's that
So-
going to do to the modern
You'll be saying,
architect? Sorry, Gar.
So there's there's a bit here where it goes back to the business model conversation, because effectively you had, so if you go back to the, am I a platform business, am I a product business, am I a customer business, and you got to figure out what you are, and the banks figured out, actually, we're not a platform business, and the platform figured out, oh, there's space for us to play here. And it was a very good choice to go one direction, because when you're conflicted, then it ends up with resource contention all over the place and bun fights over stuff we don't need to fight about because it's not our core bit.
Yeah.
And it is the capability placement.
There are people in the industry and they don't know what to do. I used to work for a company that I was in the bank and we did the stack and that was my job. Now it's not like exchange engineers, they're gone now. But at the same time, do people specialize in capability instead of delivery, generic delivery?
Yes, is my honest opinion. The reason I say that, and that's why I asked Mike the question about platforms. I still hear these conversations around what's the next platform look like? We want to centralize our platforms and offer services. And I like the thinking, but actually what I've been trying to convey, even at difficult conversations that I had in HSBC at the time, was platforms are platforms, capabilities are capabilities. And what you're initially trying to do is enable capabilities that can be assumed by the technology and business teams that are swimming in the same direction. And when I look at platform building, is you can make a choice to be a platform company, to Gar's point, as well as a product company to the DevSecOps teams in the business. But ultimately, the modern architecture is based on capability offerings that are just supported by those elements, whether it's through Thought Machine or another service provider. The choice is down to risk, like what is the risk to the business? What does it mean for the customer? And then basically all of those elements in terms of regulatory compliance and the industry perspectives that you get to choose on where to place those platforms and capabilities, if that makes sense.
Actually, I think I would agree with that. Yeah, architecture's in the business of capabilities. Platforms are in the business of collecting capabilities and presenting them so other things can get built.
Stuff that can be consumed easily.
Or consumed. But in my case, I care about providing people with Lego bricks. But something you'd mentioned about where something should be outsourced, where the pendulum is swung, and so on. I actually would say that particularly if you're working with a low-code world, behind the low-code, the architecture that enables it, that can come from anywhere. That's not really business case or business logic specific. It really is about technical quality and technical wherewithal. In front of that line, building the actual business application, that's all business process. And the closer you can get to where the customer really is, the better. That's really hard to outsource.
Yeah, one of the things that sort of hits home for a lot of the cloud full global world here is we have a fully globally distributed compute. It's one big machine, whether it's one cloud or 30 clouds or multi-cloud or hybrid cloud, it's one continuous compute fabric. And people have to stop building the monolithic app that versions. It's the service, the little capability part. It has to be able to field separately, version separately, patch separately, and lifecycle separately, because you don't know when the other parts are going to go. You can't take the dependency.
You need your application to think it's a monolith, because if you
It
don't, it can be destabilized in seconds by one component being versioned into a state that you can't depend on anymore.
But I really think it becomes incumbent on the modern developer and architect to assume the stability of that back-end component is only as good as its contract. I mean, software level contract. So
I know.
I have to hold those people responsible for revving appropriately. So I can choose to make the switch when I switch. I'm not forced and not drive a breaking build.
All I can tell you is that if you throw a citizen developer at microservices, you're going to have a bad time.
No. I think there's real safety at the very top, which is probably the low code, no code front end. There's moderate safety at the application business combination tier, and the risk and the complexity move downwards. But we should be able to say that I can get my spell checker from you, Mike, or from you, Gar, or from you, Wayne, and the best one I should be able to switch to because I like it better.
Yeah.
Okay, I see where you're going with that. Sure. All right. That's not how.
There's still like an extra here though. It's the depth of the stack is getting increasingly deep, and we don't have enough people who understand enough about it. So that's
Yeah.
becoming a pyramid of things that we're depending on, and there's some scary stuff there in terms of scenarios that you look at, and like when stuff goes wrong. And I'm curious on. I'm actually going to throw that at Stephen and Wayne. Like,
yeah, I get it, and I think Wayne's going to have a stronger point than I have here. But for me, this was one of these things I put down that I didn't send you all. The career of an architect or the career of a developer, it has changed shape. Now, people haven't changed shape with it. Some of those people are having a difficult time. But you have to decide where you are in that giant V of things, as you explained it, to have the specialization for the problems you deal with, and to be reliable and responsible and hold the literal liability for the people who are above you in the stack.
Yeah.
No thoughts, Wayne? Really?
Yeah. Well, it's such a broad conversation. Here's what my view on this. I've been doing this 32 years, and and I've seen the changes like we all have on this call. And I've been in every specialization in the architect role. Started off in infrastructure, went into application, went back into software, became an EA, blah blah blah, been around the block. We all know our favorite saying in architecture is "it depends." And there are so many scenarios. I mean, even the conversation we've just had, I'm sure there's people listening to this and wanting to give their points of view across, and they're all welcome. What I will say, just in terms of this, to Gar's point specifically, the depth of understanding. I get involved in a lot of, I get called basically to provide insight to various sort of, whether it's digital signage or it's, whatever it may be, a whole broad aspects of services, just for the roles that I've been doing. What I have found is that explosion of services and born in the cloud companies is huge. The choices that organizations and enterprises have is huge. What I do find one of the most key skills that an architect has today that is always been there but never really been brought to the forefront, which is, systems thinking in its own right, the interconnected parts. And, when you look at VUCA and the elements of systems thinking, is if you are an architect that really hasn't grasped system thinking and complexity, you are probably going to wallow in that ambiguity, as in not be able to internalize the ambiguity and communicate clarity. But what I still see a lot of architects do is they externalize the ambiguity because they're working through that complexity out loud. And I get it and understand it, but the most proficient architects like Stephen and people on this call, I see them internalize it. And that internalization using systems thinking, those techniques, are the ones that tend to, do systems that are safe, can create feature release at velocity, and meet the needs of the business and the customer from a customer centricity perspective. But it's not broadly adopted in terms of that thinking and how to think in that way, because it's a muscle that needs continuous development.
Yeah.
And as an industry, so SAFE has come up a couple of times here, and so SAFE for me is its peak complicatedness of agile, right? So we have just put it all together, and it's wonderful branding, and it looks amazing, but it's not how it really works, right?
And this is the point, Gar. I don't care. I don't care about TOGAF. I don't care about scaled agile. I don't care about lesser agile. I don't care about discipline agile. I shouldn't say this on the call. But the reason I don't care is a good architect that has embraced systems thinking knows the depth of these frameworks, as an example, knows how to apply them in terms of an organization, in terms of those stress points, and then basically things move forward. And if you're a purist in any of these conversations around any of those, you'll fail. I'll give you an example in HSBC. Scaled agile DevSecOps team, overlaid with lesser agile because of the compliancy reasons, with an overlay of discipline agile development on top of that. You'd never communicate that to your environment in terms of the technology teams of the business, but that's what was needed to actually, and then obviously enterprise architecture using TOGAF over here. And I say that, there are benefits to TOGAF, so don't say I'm not saying that.
The open group is listening.
It's the elements of these things together. Never be a purist, and have the systems thinking and understanding at the depth of these types of conversations to make constructive choices, and then you end up in a good place.
I agree. This dovetails back to what Steve was talking about in terms of architects need to do things in order to deliver stability to, among other things, people like my customers. But what you were talking about is, it occurs to me, yeah, agile done well, okay? Yes, agile done well, the way you were talking about it, is wonderful. You know what can't be done that way? It never works. Business applications. Business applications are almost always built waterfall style because they're, people have fixed budgets to deliver some piece of functionality. They want a schedule. They want a level of predictability because it's often not.
This is where I respectfully, we have this argument that, remember waterfall had an arrow going back up originally.
Yes. Oh, I know.
What I mean? So it's sort of like,
not iterative, though.
I'm just joking. It ties back to that conversation when we start talking about waterfall versus agile.
But if you don't do agile, my clients can't do waterfall, and waterfall is the only thing they're going to tolerate. But waterfall requires radically reduced risk.
Yeah.
But in the world of reduced risk, we're kind of coming around to the top of the hour, and I just want to throw this little hand grenade into the room, a gift from me to you. Blockchain, cryptocurrency, these are buzzwords of the day that are essentially chaos on steroids, on software, right? Nobody owns it. We're all involved. We're all going to do the right things or not, but we're all going to benefit from this wonderful new thing. I don't see modern architecture adapting to them. Maybe you all are, but they're things and they're real. Don't get me started on NFTs. But what do you all think about that?
I've made an NFT of this while we were doing it.
Oh, great.
You make a fortune.
I owned it. Well, I've got my copy, so, we're good.
Good.
Love the idea of a blockchain. Hate the idea of a distributed blockchain. I'm the one that has to deal with this the least of the four of us, so I'll make the most flippant, blankets, irresponsible statement possible. Just the waste of computing power and energy that's involved, the amount of effort and time it takes to get critical mass for something to commit, and the proof of work as opposed to proof of ownership, being able to document that is just it can't scale. A blockchain is a really good idea. Doing it in a distributed fashion is not. At some point, we're going to have to coordinate and centralize this stuff and have a clearinghouse approach to blockchain type stuff, and then we might see some work get done.
But this is the modern architecture problem, right? There's something people see that is valuable and they want it.
I like immutable stuff. I just don't want to break the planet to deliver it.
It's a hype suppression system. Like you need a hype suppression system to just spray on people to take it down.
Yeah, you mentioned a couple of things that are interconnected but not interconnected. So if I look at financial services organizations building cryptocurrency is obviously built on blockchain in terms of providing that distributed ledger. Is that whole premise that sits behind blockchain. The interesting thing for me is it's been around for 10, 15 years in terms of the conversation. But actually what I'm seeing, especially in the financial services industry, it's now become real. If you look at the Indian government basically deciding to float the rupee in terms of cryptocurrency, and you look at what organizations are doing, the sticking point for blockchain for cryptocurrency initially was just purely political. It was political in terms of basically whether that was going to be, does it disrupt, financial services markets, et cetera, But the technology that sits underneath it has matured to a point where the banks are now using blockchain for their own cryptocurrency definitions. So I think for its good points and its bad points and its distributed ledgers and basically its service contracts and all of the good stuff that sits around blockchain, I think we'll see more and more in terms of solutions built with that blockchain mindset. That's just my gut feeling, is there'll be more blockchain considerations coming into play for the modern architect to consider.
I absolutely agree with exactly what you just said, and nothing one might irresponsibly extrapolate from it.
Yeah,
What you said is absolutely right.
correct. I'm not saying whether it's good or bad, but it's
Yeah.
happening.
But we are
No, I
coming
think
up
it's
to our
probably
last
good.
couple of minutes here. So I'm going to kind of haul everybody back in from the bomb I set off, and I won't apologize for that because that's where the fun is. You know, I think modern architecture has to come from all of these different points of view and somehow get along. The people who are doing crypto and blockchain, maybe they're surrounded for safety, so they're held separately. Or maybe they're buried into the bottom, so there's trusted and stability to be used from the top. But we need to change. It's us old architects who are, I think, are leaning forward further than the new ones are.
Well, you raise an excellent point. If we do cryptocurrency the way Bitcoin is laid out, it will break things. If we do cryptocurrency better than Bitcoin, now we're on to something. Our jobs have to change so that we do it better than Bitcoin.
We have been
Gentlemen, we're in the last minute. I'm hoping we can do a quick, if everybody could do a quick, maybe 20-second, what's the highlight? I think that'd be a great way to finish.
Gar, I'm throwing you on the bus.
Damn it. So actually, one thing that just came up on, and it's something I've been thinking about. So Steve Kerr, coach of the Golden State Warriors, described the way they played as fast, loose, and disciplined. And I think that's the way we'll do modern architecture, right? It's fast, it's loose, it's disciplined. And I think that's got to be the mindset we're going into on it. And it's the quality of the work. It's not any particular practice or anything else, but it's that idea. And with a sense of joy as well, is the way he describes the way they play. And I think we need to be moving towards that. I think we all
love that
do.
sense of joy. That's actually awesome, Gar.
Thanks, Bryce.
Mike.
I love the idea. Actually, what Gar said is absolutely right.
Okay.
The end game or the end goal of that is to provide flexibility with stability. How you do it, if you do it poorly, you'll achieve neither of those goals. So it's not like whatever it takes to give me what I want. That's not what I'm asking for. But what you're trying to build is not necessarily something beautiful, elegant, and chaotic that seems to still work. It's something beautiful, elegant, and produces something that appears, at least to me, to be clear and risk-free.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike. I like that the chaotic gets removed from that. That's an important point. Awesome. Mr. Wayne.
Yeah, I love fast, loose, and disciplined. As in that's a great description of what good architecture should be. I'd also add the elements in that. And again, this is just from the role perspective specifically. You know, architects need to be thinking from an innovation perspective, not just from a design and build perspective, because that's where the role, you know, what we talked about earlier is going to be. They're going to have to be innovative on solutions because the physics are now out the window. And velocity done safely. You know, it touches on Gar's point. Is people talk about velocity, especially at the CIO level, for feature release, but obviously the architectural guardrails that sit around that is obviously ensuring that it's done safely. So yeah, love all of those comments, Gar and Mike.
Thanks, Wayne. I like the fast, loose, and disciplined up to a velocity that's safe. So no driving 120.
No.
We got to go with safe at the time. I like that.
One, Bryce.
Steven, final comments.
Yeah, closing thoughts. First, I want to thank Iasa for this opportunity. I love the chance to speak with my peers here that I don't get often enough. This is the way we learn, is this interaction amongst ourselves. And I wish we could do it more often. In terms of just sort of the closing thought, I think we're maturing in the world, and architects have to start thinking about governance and liability. That people are taking hard dependencies on us to do the right thing. It's not a toy anymore. And we need to be able to lean into that, take all these skills and these capabilities and the thought processes and really make it government trustworthy.